Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I know you've got a lot going on, and there was some big news last week for you, so I know it's probably been a busy time.
It's been both exhausted and exciting, but I'm thankful the campaign is behind me, and I'm looking forward to hopefully playing a role in setting DC on fire.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with the. Oh yeah. I'll start with the big news. So last week you officially declared victory in your race. I know that it's been it's taken New York quite some time to count mail-in ballots, and there's still some things going on there. But you had a sizable lead on election day. What motivated you to declare victory now versus continuing to wait for those mail-in ballots to get counted?
Yeah, so this is an unusual election because it's unfolding against the backdrop of COVID-19. About half the electorate cast their ballots in person, and half the electorate cast their ballots via absentee. And so even though I had a considerable lead on primary day about a month ago, I thought it would be premature to declare victory without knowing where 50% of the electorate stood. So I refrained from declaring victory prematurely, but in the final analysis, I had more than 10 points among in-person voters compared to my second place rival, and among absentee voters, I had more than 20 points. So my lead expanded with the absentee vote.
All right. Yeah, and of course, congratulations. I guess what has the experience been like having to wait this long to really come out and declare victory and have that final say versus, in a traditional year you would have known much closer to election day?
COVID-19 has stripped me of the excitement that would naturally come from declaring victory on primary day and holding a party with my supporters. The sense of celebration on primary day was gone. But I'm grateful to have won, and I'm going to represent an iconic congressional district. The South Bronx is said to be the poorest congressional district in America, but COVID-19 has shown it to be the essential congressional district. It's home to the essential workers, mostly women of color, who are the heart and soul of our city and our country. And the thought of representing the essential workers and mothers of the South Bronx is the realization of a dream. And that's something for which I'm grateful.
And, now that we've gotten to the next phase of your campaign, what does this phase look like? What are you working on, and what's on the agenda between now and November?
So I'm laying the groundwork for the transition. So meeting with civic leaders and institutional leaders throughout the congressional district, meeting with progressive leaders throughout the country, holding events in support of young progressives who are running for public office elsewhere in the country, building a strong district office staff and a strong legislative office staff. I've been writing op-eds, weighing in on issues of importance. Wrote an op-ed about Puerto Rican statehood or about Afro-Latino identity in the context of the Congressional Hispanic and Congressional Black Caucus within Congress. So I've been active, and I continue to be a city council member, so I'm passing legislation. Yesterday, I passed legislation that restructures the Department of Consumer Affairs as the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. So under local law, for the first time in New York City's history, the city is going to have its own labor agency, its own agency specifically dedicated to the protection of workers. And the law empowers the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection to secure financial restitution for workers exploited by their employers, whether it be women of color, low-wage earners, undocumented immigrants.
No, that's great. I'm sure, and I'm sure that's laying the framework for things that you'll want to work on, later this year, provided everything goes well in November. And speaking of your campaign,
and we continue to, in the district, we continue to conduct food distribution. So we distribute warm meals, groceries, personal protective equipment to those in need. People are deeply cynical about elected officials because the criticism is elected officials, you show up when it's election time. And then once you win, you disappear from the surface of the earth and then magically reappear in time for your reelection. I thought it was important to make it crystal clear from the very beginning that I'm going to be a visible, vocal presence in the district in all seasons, not simply the political season. And so we have been active from the moment we won.
And speaking of your campaign, I've read that you personally contracted COVID-19 while you were running for office. So I guess, more so than many politicians right now, you have a firsthand experience with it. So what was that like? How serious was your case and what was your recovery like?
Thankfully, I did contract COVID-19. I was the first member of the New York City Council to be diagnosed with COVID-19. I was able to manage my battle with COVID without hospitalization, but I did have symptoms resembling the flu, fever, chills, fatigue, extreme fatigue. Thankfully, I had no trouble breathing. Even though I'm an asthmatic, my breathing was largely fine in my battle with COVID. But it took me out of commission for about a month. And I had to keep a distance from my loved ones, including my mother, who at age 60 is high risk, especially because she has hypertension. So, to keep a distance from your own family, to think of yourself as a health threat to your own family, was a demoralizing experience.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Going back to the race, one of your opponents, Ruben Diaz Sr., has a history of making homophobic and transphobic remarks. So what was it like for you running against him as an openly gay candidate? And, how does it feel now to have defeated him? What message do you think that sends to the people in your district?
Change has come. I ran in the most fiercely contested congressional primary in New York City. There were 12 candidates, including 5 elected officials. And the front runner was Ruben Diaz Sr., who is notoriously the most anti-LGBTQ, anti-choice, pro-Trump elected official in New York State politics. In the 1990s, he said that the gay Olympics would lead to the spread of AIDS. In the early 2000s, he was the only Democrat in the state Senate to vote against marriage equality. He has compared abortion to the Holocaust. And even though he has a right-wing view of the world, there was a real risk that a Trump Republican masquerading as a Democrat could represent the bluest congressional district in America because he had 80% name recognition. He had the same exact name as his son, who's the most popular elected official in the Bronx. And he has an irreducible base of evangelical support, and the conventional wisdom held that he could not be beaten, that this race could not be won, and that certainly an openly LGBTQ congressional candidate like myself had no chance. But against all odds, with our support from the grassroots, we not only won, but we defeated him to the point of driving him into retirement. So we retired the politics of hate and fear in the Bronx and in New York City. In his own backyard, I won 43% of the absentee vote, defeating Ruben Diaz Sr. by a margin of 4-1. That is as overwhelming a rejection of the politics of hate and fear that you could imagine. And it demonstrates that voters are hungering for a new generation of leadership that represents the full mosaic of America's multiracial, multi-ethnic, queer democracy. The triumph of an openly LGBTQ candidate over the worst homophobe in New York State politics is a definitive sign of progress. And it's one thing to have an openly LGBTQ member of Congress from the gay meccas of New York City, like Chelsea or the Village. It's something else to have it in the South Bronx, in a place where you at least expect it. That, to me, is a singular breakthrough for LGBTQ representation in communities of color.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've already made history once as the youngest and first openly LGBTQ elected official from the Bronx. If you're sworn in this November, you'll make history as the first out Afro-Latino in Congress. Why do you think it's taken so long for LGBTQ candidates of color to break through at this level? Especially coming from a place as progressive as New York.
Look, even in New York, you face systemic racism and homophobia. Candidates of color, LGBTQ candidates of color, face deeply ingrained barriers to accessing public office. And you have to be exceptional to break through. So that's why it's taken a long time. And this was a hard fight, but I feel optimistic about the future of LGBTQ representation, right? The fact that both Mondaire and I were elected in the same cycle is a powerful demonstration of progress. One of my favorite quotes is, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably going to be on the menu. And finally, LGBT communities of color have a seat at the table in the halls of Congress.
And something I've written about in the past has been about representation. Basically, if there aren't people in Congress who look like us or who share the same lived experiences, then they won't govern for us. So when you're in Congress, what will your presence there mean for the LGBTQ community, especially for LGBTQ people of color? What do you hope they take away from your success?
Look, for democracy to be truly representative, it has to be every bit as diverse as the country itself, right? What I find frustrating is when we're debating issues like affirmative action, there's often a false dichotomy set between diversity and quality, as though these were two distinct or even mutually exclusive values. Quite the opposite. Diversity is part of quality. Right? Diversity in representation improves the quality of government because it ensures that the widest possible range of lived experiences and perspectives inform public policy. The public policy is speaking not only to the situation of a narrow few, but to the experiences of the broadest possible cross-section of Americans. So I would argue that diversity is not simply a buzzword, but it makes government more effective, more responsive, more representative, which is what a democracy should be. And people have a right to see themselves in their elected leaders. We're living in a time of institutional failure, right? Public confidence in institutions, including government, has been shaken. And there is nothing like genuine representation to restore public confidence. I think if people see themselves and their own struggles and their own lived experiences in their elected officials, then the end result is going to be greater public confidence, greater legitimacy.
And on the flip side, when you're the first of any group to break into these older institutions, sometimes there can be pressure, to kind of carry the whole community on your shoulders. Do you feel any kind of, I mean, not negative pressure, but do you feel that pressure? Do you feel like everyone's counting on you, or how do you deal with that pressure, or the those kind of expectations?
The burden of representation. Look,
Yeah.
So it is not lost to me that I'm entering Congress as an LGBTQ trailblazer and as a representative of the poorest congressional district in America. And so with those realities comes the burden of representation. I'm going to work my heart out. I'm not a miracle worker. I cannot pluck a magic wand out of thin air and solve every problem affecting the South Bronx. But I'm a worker, and I'm going to work my heart out for not only the people of the South Bronx, but for every single American, especially in the LGBTQ community. I have a burning desire to excel as a public servant, to be an agent for change in DC. So is it a burden? Yes, but it's one that I embrace wholeheartedly.
And thinking about everything that's going on in the country right now, why did 2020 feel like the right year for you to run for this position? Why did this feel like the right time?
We are living in a changed moment that's creating space for a new generation of leadership. We're living in a time when young people are making their presence known in politics. Black Lives Matters has become the rallying cry of our nation. I think a powerful case could be made that we're living in an age of racial enlightenment. And we're much more enlightened as a society about the reality of systemic racism. COVID-19 is a manifestation of systemic racism. Police brutality is a manifestation of systemic racism. And since we are more racially enlightened as a country than we've ever been, we have a historic opportunity to address the deeply rooted injustices and inequality that have been in the making for 400 years, to address the systemic racism that the 1619 Project has come to light. So to live in a moment when we have a historic opportunity to confront historical racism to an extent that has not been done before, I think that's uniquely exciting.
Right. And once you're officially in office, I guess whether it's your first 100 days or your first year in office, what will be your primary focuses on the policy issues that you're going after?
Well, I'll speak specifically and then broadly. Specifically, I want to focus like a laser on confronting the affordability crisis. Right? Americans are struggling with the coping costs of housing, healthcare, and higher education. And in New York City, the greatest manifestation of the affordability crisis is the housing crisis in the Bronx. More than 50% of the residents there pay more than half their income toward their rent. And that's before you factor in the necessities of life, like food, transportation, prescription drugs, utilities. And so I'm in favor of housing vouchers for all. Every American in need should have access to a housing voucher, which would cap rent at 30% of income so that you have enough disposable income to address the necessities of life. I'm in favor of expanding the child tax credit, which would deliver hundreds of dollars in income support to the poorest families in America, especially in the South Bronx. But more broadly, we're the only country in the industrialized world that fails to have a comprehensive social safety net, right? Most countries in Europe, most countries in the industrialized world have a safety net that provides universal education, universal healthcare, universal paid time in the workplace. So I think there needs to be a commitment to establishing a comprehensive social safety net in the United States that establishes both healthcare and housing as human rights. What we need is a reinvestment in America on the scale of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. That's the kind of boldness that we need from the next president, whom I'm confident will be Joe Biden. Anything less than that would be a profound failure.
And then my last question. So you started out in politics at a young age. Now you're kind of looking at the next phase with Congress. What are your ultimate goals for your political career?
I never plan 20 steps ahead when it comes to politics. I feel like it's dangerous to put the politics ahead of the governing. My conviction is that if you govern effectively, then the politics will take care of itself. The voters will want you to move upward politically. So my focus is on excelling as a member of Congress and delivering for the people of the South Bronx. And I let the future politics take care of itself.